In the previous two lessons, what we did was spend some time talking about specifically Kaiser Wilhelm II. And that's because the Kaiser is the central figure in German politics in the 1890s going through into the early 1900s. But he's not the only key figure in politics. We have to also think about the growth of parliamentary government, and that's going to be the topic of this lesson. We're going to talk about the growth and the growing role of the Reichstag, the parliament of the German state, and we're going to talk about some of the key political parties, the SDP, for example, the shift in Chancellor and the role of the Chancellor, as well as some of the reforms that we start to see later on in this time period. So fundamentally then, the Reichstag has a very important role when we think about the unification of Germany in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, going through all the way up until near the beginning of World War I. So fundamentally, one of the things that we see immediately in the unification of Germany is the expansion of electoral participation. From 1871 onwards, all adult males over 25 could vote in Reichstag elections. Turnout, as a result of which, would grow dramatically over time, representing only about 51% of the eligible voters in 1871. This number had risen all the way up to as much as 85% by 1912. The signal here that is being presented is that there is a significant rise in public engagement. More and more people who are allowed to involve themselves in politics, namely adult males, being an adult meant you were 25 or over at this point, this engagement in politics was seemingly on the rise. And what we start to see as well is that with more and more people voting in these elections, we start to see political parties begin to mature into organised blocs. You have conservatives, you have national liberals, you have the centre parties, you have the progressives, and then most notably for our purposes, you have the SPD, the Social Democrats. These become really, really powerful vehicles for channeling popular demands into formal politics. And so the Reichstag would increase in terms of its power and authority, specifically in two areas. The first is in fiscal responsibilities, and the second is in the influence through legislation. Legislation is just a law, okay? For example, our Parliament in Westminster passes what we call legislation. These institutions that pass legislation are called the legislatures. The legislature of the United Kingdom is Parliament. The legislature of sort of a post-unification German Empire is the Reichstag. Now, the Reichstag did hold real power over specifically a number of fiscal elements. So fiscal meaning sort of money and economic kind of policy. Fiscal policy over things like the national budget, as well as lawmaking. Because since without its approval, neither taxes nor laws could actually pass into authority. So the Kaiser could not, nor could the Chancellor, just pass new taxes or issue new taxes or pass a new law without the approval of the Reichstag, which gives the Reichstag a certain amount of authority. By the early 1900s, we start to see what are called coalitions begin to coalesce. A coalition is simply a group of multiple political parties coming together to form a group, to form a coalition of authority. So coalitions often form in politics when there is not enough votes for one single party to secure what we call a majority. So, for example, in the United Kingdom in 2010, none of the political parties won enough votes, won enough seats in Parliament to actually get a majority. And so what that meant was they would have to, the largest party, which was the Conservative Party at the time, had to form an alliance with a different party. They formed an alliance with the Liberal Democrats, and they sort of formed what becomes known as a coalition. Now, in certain electoral systems, there is a higher chance that there may need to be coalitions. So in what is sometimes known as a proportional representation system, it basically means that the percentage of the votes that a particular political party gets roughly matches the percentage of seats. Where there are loads and loads of political parties, all the votes are sort of fragmented across all of these different political parties. No one single party ever really gets a majority, and so coalitions have to be formed quite often. And so that's what we'll see here in the early 1900s, and it's what we'll see quite a lot when we look at the Weimar Republic as well. And so these coalitions of economic liberals, progressives, and increasingly the social democrats began to successfully push through a number of reforms that were aimed at dismantling some of the feudal restrictions in German society, abolishing things like usury laws, erasing trade and travel, as well as broadening press and parliamentary freedoms. We start to see quite a liberal shift in the early 1900s. And with that liberal shift, we get the rise of the Social Democrats. The SPD saw the Reichstag as a useful tool for representation, and they went from only having 11 seats in 1890 to having as many as 110 seats by 1912. So in a relatively short amount of time, in just 22 years, they get tenfold the number of seats that they originally had. And this made the Social Democrats the single largest party in the Reichstag. This surge was reflected a number of different things, mainly lots of quite big changes in society in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Germany. Particularly things like industrialization and urbanization. These are things that we will look at in future lessons' time. Though the Kaiser feared the kind of socialist politics that existed in the SPD. The SPD's presence increasingly pressed the state to introduce social reforms, covering things like workplace safety, accident insurance, pensions, maternity leave, etc., even as anti-socialist measures waned in their effectiveness. Some of these welfare state provisions and policies, things like social insurance and things like that, these existed as early as Bismarck. Bismarck, in fact, believed that the use of these policies would try and stave off against the idea of socialism being implemented in Germany. Now, while Bismarck had traditionally maintained quite a lot of control as Chancellor, Kaiser Wilhelm II obviously dismisses him in 1890, and from then on, the chancellors who were in office were directly appointed by the Chancellor, and they were dependent on both the Reichstag for legislation and then also the Kaiser for personal favour. So chancellors began to exert fewer and fewer amounts of influence as time went on. Things like, for example, fiscal coalitions forced the Chancellor, who immediately replaced Bismarck, Chancellor Bülow, to resign in 1909. Chancellor Bethlen Hollweg faced a vote of no confidence in December 1913 over something known as the Zabern affair. Even though it didn't force his resignation, it showed that this sort of being stuck in the middle between both the Kaiser on the one hand, ensuring that he has favour, and also having the Reichstag on the other hand, meant that the Chancellor was very, very, very limited in things that he could do in relation to being stuck between these two extreme positions. And although the Kaiser held command over the military and the navy, things like naval budget increases would require the approval of the Reichstag. And so it shouldn't go without saying that the Reichstag had quite a lot of power and authority over specific areas of law and policy during the period of Kaiser Wilhelm II. It wasn't just an institution that had no authority whatsoever. So just bear that in mind when we start thinking about some of the social reforms, some of the military reforms, and some of the economic policies that we're going to look at over the next 4 lessons before we then think about World War I and then the establishment of the Weimar Republic.